Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, as you can see, we're zipping right along with our ST70 build. This has been a fairly long build series because I'm really trying to put the details in there for new DIYers. And for you guys that, build a lot of these amps yourself, I'm sure this is super boring, but hey, that's okay. Part of what I do on this channel is encourage new DIYers to build stuff like this. And I really think this is a great starting point for a DIY hobbyist to do as their first build. You end up with a really nice amp that hits way above its price point, which is kind of the point of building kits to start with. Well, again, I wanted to kind of refresh the startup portion of the final series of videos, and so let's get busy finishing this amp up. Okay, so hopefully we can zip this along. Might be a little longer video, but I want to get this front end or the front panel wired up to the amp, and we will be done. So this amp uses a kind of unique old school thing of putting these octal sockets on the front. And originally they were used so that you could plug like a preamp or something into these sockets and like borrow some power for the filaments, or potentially have the input signals going through these octal sockets. And the only thing we're going to be using these for is as a measuring point for the bias to adjust the bias on the tubes. Now originally they had pairs of tubes tied together that shared a bias pot, and the modern board we're using has, I call a four-corner bias, where each tube has its own bias pot. So we need to pull two wires from each cathode up to the front of the amp to measure. And the amp originally had this point here, which is the cathodes of these tubes, grounded through a resistor to the chassis back here, and then the return signal path for the output tubes went through the metal chassis, around the rectifier tube and everything, all the way over here to this star ground point. And we're not going to be doing that. We already have to run a wire from here up to the front of the amp, and from here to the front of the amp, so we can measure the bias. So instead of grounding it back here, we're going to have the sense resistor or the shunt resistor go across the tube socket to a point that we're going to designate as a ground, and then we're going to run a ground wire from here over to our star ground point. And that way the signal's not going through this metal chassis with all the noise and issues that could create. And then we have our little RCA jack board here. We installed these nickel-plated RCA jacks. It comes with gold ones. I think these nickel-plated ones kind of fit the theme of the amp better. And it gets attached right here. And then where this switch is, we have this potentiometer / stepped attenuator that installs right here and gets wired between these RCA jacks and the board. So one of the first things I'm going to do is, these sockets are installed like this with the index slot facing this direction. And so we're going to orient it the way that historically these have been installed, just for historical sake. The other thing, though, that I do is, we're not going to be using these three terminals. So I bend these over and cut them off just so they don't get in the way of anything. There's no reason for them to exist because we're not hooking anything up to them. And then what we're going to be doing is, we're going to be putting the sense resistor from this terminal to this terminal, and the same thing over here from this terminal to this terminal. This is going to be the rear tube cathode. This will be the front tube cathode wire. And then this is going to be connected to our star ground point. So I'm going to go ahead and solder the resistors onto these sockets. Again, it goes from this pin. Let me zoom in here. We're going to be running a 10 ohm resistor from here to there, and from here to here, using these lower holes. And then this is going to go to the star ground point. This is going to connect with a wire to the rear output tube cathode, and this one is going to connect to the front output tube cathode. And then these two wires, I'm going to wire it up like the amp was historically wired and run the 6.3 volt to these two pins for no other reason than we can check the heater voltage on the front of the amp without having to open it up. And then these two terminals, the outboard ones, will go over to filament, 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 filament of each side. So let me go ahead and get those resistors wired onto these sockets, get the sockets bolted in place, and we'll show you how to wire up one channel. The other will be the identical, so we won't need to show you that. And then we can get to wiring up the RCA jacks, and we'll have this amp ready to power up and listen to. Okay, so we're going to prep the sockets before we install them into the amplifier chassis. So we're going to take these 10 ohm resistors, and I measured each of these to make sure they were really close to 10 ohms, because it's important that all of these are real close to 10 ohms so that you get an accurate milliamp reading. And these are what are called a shunt resistor, and they are put into the circuit solely for the reason of being able to measure the voltage across of them, and from that voltage calculate up the amperage draw. And a lot of amp meters actually work off of a shunt like this, and I'm pretty sure that the one that they sell that you can put in place of these sockets, if you choose to, work in that way, that they use these 10 ohm resistors to calculate up what the amperage draw is for you. So we're going to put one of these resistors like this across this terminal to this terminal. And so I'm going to go ahead and solder this bottom hole in on that one, and then kind of prop it up and let it sit like that. And then we're going to take this second resistor and we're going to put it in this bottom hole, have them share that hole there, and then go into, we can go ahead and trim that off a little bit, give us some room, and then put this other lead to this other bottom hole like that, and put it across those two terminals. And it's going to be a little easier to solder if you stand it up on its side like that, and then you don't have to worry about the solder running down into somewhere that you don't want it to go. Because with soldering, gravity is your friend. There's those two. And then we'll solder this little guy. Just like that. So basically we're using this octal socket as a tag strip to attach parts to. And then scoot that guy over a little bit, and there we go. So I know this is really redundant, but we're connecting this pin to here, this pin to here with 10 ohm resistors. This is going to go to our star ground point, so this will be a ground, and it'll have a wire going over the star ground point. And then this will go to the front tube cathode, pins 1 and 8 tied together, and then this goes to the rear tube. And this is the one that's marked to check the bias at 1.56 volts, and we'll get into that and we just use the pin opposite it diagonally so it would be easy to remember. So let me go do the other one and then get these bolted into the chassis, and I'll show you how to wire all this stuff up. Okay, so we got our sockets bolted in, and we ran this pin down here, goes over here to pins 1 and 8 on this socket, and then this wire here kind of loops down, it goes over to pins 1 and 8 over here. So like this is a cathode, that's a cathode, and we have these two 10 ohm resistors that go to here. This terminal is going to then have a ground wire that goes from here around over into our start ground point. Same thing over here. We have this front tube is kind of looped under and connected to this pin, which will be the one on the front that is marked by a set. And then the one diagonally from it comes over here to this rear tube, pins 1 and 8, cathode. And then 10 ohm resistors. This is going to be our ground for the cathodes, and then it's going to run over here to our star ground point as well. This is the front end board ground point. This is going to have a ground wire running from here to here. As you remember, we insulated this board from the chassis so that this will be the only ground for the whole front end is going to come over here to the star ground point. So we're not going to have any of the chassis in the signal path. So here's our little RCA board, and these are a little wider spaced than the original so that modern RCA cables will plug into them. But you can't put super fat ones, but you can put normal size RCA jacks instead of those little tiny skinny things they used in the past. And just make sure that the ground of these RCAs is not touching the chassis. It's a really tight fit, so you might have to kind of wiggle things around a little bit, and it's a really small gap between the outside of these jacks and the chassis, but it will clear. If you do have some issues, you could take a round file and file out the chassis just a breath to give you a little more breathing room, but I didn't need to do that. And then you would normally put the dummy mono stereo switch here, but we're using this stepped attenuator, and so we put the two screws with nuts just to fill the holes up, and it's going to sit right here. So the next thing we need to do is we need to connect this to this ground, and I'm going to run a short wire straight down from here to the board ground, and then I'm going to run a wire from here over to the stepped attenuator grounds, and then we'll run this wire over to the outboard pin on the stepped attenuator, and then we'll run the inboard pin, which is the wiper, down to the front end board on the input side. So let me bend all these wires up, and then I'll get a close-up zoom in and kind of show you how this potentiometer is wired up. Okay, so we're getting this stepped attenuator installed, and what I did is I pulled this ground from the board up here to the RCA jack grounds, which are these two little lugs that go up underneath the nuts, and I've tied them together right here to get, in the middle. So we got a ground, goes down to the board. This black wire comes up over, goes up behind this board here, and then comes through and ties both of these two pins on the end together. These are both the ground for the stepped attenuator, where the signal gets attenuated through this ground. Then the end terminal comes up over and connects to the center of this RCA jack. So the signal is across the resistance of this stepped attenuator, and then the signal is pulled off the center of it. And so this center terminal comes up, over, and eventually it's going to go down to this terminal right here. And this stuff in the back here is a little tight, so be careful. Make sure you flush trim these solder joints off, because you can see there's that nut right there that would easily short out. And I added one small thin washer between the washer it comes with and the attenuator, just to give me a little more breathing room back here between this nut, which is for appearance, to fill up the hole that's drilled in the front of the chassis. And so the nut, not this screw, is what really comes close to shorting out to this center terminal. So just make sure when you get done tightening everything down and you get this part wired up, and before we connect this ground over here, we want to make sure that these RCA jack bodies and this wire are not shorted out to the chassis. After you've installed that ground wire over there, you can't diagnose that. So board's insulated right now. We need to make sure that this and this and this thing here are all infinity ohms, or no continuity between the chassis and this. And that way we know that we haven't shorted anything out. And make sure that all this stuff isn't touching back up in here. This is going to be easy to solder up, because on this side, this goes to the center, and then the center terminal here comes down and goes to that terminal on the board. So let me get that soldered up and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, and so here's the final wiring. Again, we have this center terminal in the back row, goes to the input on the board. The center of the right RCA goes to this terminal, which is the outboard on the board. Then we have this center goes to the outboard on this one. We have these two tied together. These are the ground for this attenuator, whether you're using a potentiometer or a stepped attenuator. And then it comes over here, connects to the center point ground of the two RCA jacks, and then that has a ground wire that comes down here to the ground of the board. So that's got our stepped attenuator wired up, and now all we've got left is to run the heaters for the tubes from this output tube, daisy chain it up to the board. I'm going to go ahead and connect it up to these two terminals on this octal socket, so that we have a external point for measuring the heater voltage, just so we can keep an eye on that. And then this will come over here to the board. Same over here. These two terminals are going to come around, attach here and here. Probably do the inside ones, and then have these two outboards come down here. I'm going to go ahead and get those wires all bent up, and I'll show you how those connect. And then we hook the grounds up, and we're ready to power this thing up. So that wraps up another segment of this ST70 new kit build. Want to add that this is not sponsored by Tubes for Hi-Fi, nor do I have any affiliation with them. This kit was drop shipped to me by a viewer that commissioned me to build this for them. Now, I don't normally do kit builds professionally, so yeah, I may or may not be willing to do it in the future. We'll see what that's all about, but for now, we're just doing this one for the channel and for some fun. I want to thank all you Patreon supporters and folks that make donations at my website. If you find this information useful, please consider joining my Patreon or making a donation at my website. It really helps fund future projects and keeps this channel going. I also want to thank you regular viewers, and especially you subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, please click the subscribe button. It's not a big deal to do. It doesn't cost you anything, and it helps the channel grow and other people see my fun content. So that's going to wrap this up. Until the next segment, have a nice day.